Today, Latin music is an important part of the cultural identity of Latin Americans or Latinos, who make up 17% of the U.S. population. But in the first half of the 20th century, Hispanic immigrants to the U.S. did not have the same unified cultural identity. Jazz music, which was based in improvisation, served as a platform for Latin American musicians to exchange and explore musical ideas, creating a new genre called Latin jazz or Afro-Cuban jazz. This new genre served as the base for a wave of Latin music, such as salsa, which unified Latinos of different backgrounds in their love of music and dance. Latin jazz was an art form that allowed Latinos to encounter an identity as Americans, while still maintaining a part of their cultural heritage. Cultural identity is a hard concept to define. Just like our personal identities are always evolving, cultural identities also change and evolve. It is also hard to define a group of people without using stereotypes. In trying to understand cultural identity, it can be helpful to look at the common sense of values, languages, and interests of a group of people. Music, for example, is an important part of our culture because it brings us together. It puts melodies and words to our lives and allows us to express ourselves. When we talk about identity, music plays an important part in how people, especially young people, find themselves. In the early 20th century, groups of Latin Americans did not have a truly Latin American music form that represented their experience as Latinos living in the U.S. There was jazz, which was mainly played by white and black musicians, and there was Latin music such as rumba played by Latinos. Rumba was mostly based on the Cuban style of music that mixes Spanish and Afro-Cuban music called son. The first and most famous Latin dance style recording was the Peanut Bender, El Manicero, by Don Aspiazu. The success of El Manicero launched a decade of rumba mania all around the United States, and with that, it introduced Cuban percussion instruments and Cuban rhythms to the country. But even when rumba experienced a surge in popularity, it was always considered to be a foreign music and not American. Jazz developed as a musical art form during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in New Orleans. Its roots came from the blues, gospel music, and other musical traditions of the South. Jazz is a style of improvisation, and because of that, it allows people to create new ideas and communicate via the creation of music. Jazz was a genre that was always evolving. One of its most important elements was swing. Swing is impossible to notate, but it could be described as the accent that you put in the rhythm that gives the music its unique characteristics. One of the early pioneers of jazz, Louis Armstrong, said about swing, "If you don't feel it, you'll never know it." This focus on swing was important for the creation of Latin jazz, as jazz musicians were interested in exploring new rhythms in swing. The element of improvisation made jazz the perfect base for exploring and exchanging new musical ideas. With jazz, two musicians that had never played together before could meet and make music together on the spot. This made it possible to blend different musical genres such as Cuban music and jazz together. In the end of the 1930s, bebop appeared. Bebop was the result of younger jazz musicians trying to change the swing style for a more demanding rhythm. Bebop is characterized for its fast tempo, instrumental diversity, and elaborated improvisation. Musicians like Charlie Parker, Wes Montgomery, Donald Byrd, and Dizzy Gillespie used bebop in their songs and style. Latin jazz, or then known as Afro-Cuban jazz, was built from the fusion of Cuban music and bebop. It is said that the fusion between these two styles of music had happened before during jam sessions, where musicians improvised for many hours, but in the early days it was not given a name or defined as a genre of jazz. Mario Bauza, a famous Cuban musician, arranger, and composer from La Habana, is often credited for being one of the founders of Latin jazz. Bauza moved to New York in 1925. he became part of the city's jazz scene and took part in the recordings of the Peanut Bender as a saxophonist. He was hired in the Chick Webb's orchestra as a trumpeter and musical director in 1933. In the band, he met Dizzy Gillespie. In December 1941, he became the musical director of Machito and his Afro-Cubans, a band led by Machito that, with the arrangements from Bauza, became the first band to blend jazz with clave, a typical rhythmic pattern from Afro-Cuban music. With this style, they made the first authentic Latin jazz tune called tanga. Mario Bauza introduced Chano Pozo to Dizzy Gillespie, since Dizzy was looking for a Cuban percussionist for his big band. Pozo died a year after he began playing with Dizzy, but before he died, the two co-wrote one of the most famous Latin jazz songs, Manteca, in 1947. Manteca became one of the most important additions to Latin jazz made in the United States and a jazz standard. For Mario Bauza, Afro-Cuban jazz was not only in music but a cultural movement to express pride in his African and Latin roots. His godfather, Arturo, taught him to never let anyone disrespect your culture and the legacy you represent, and Mario based his work and life on these words. The name Afro-Cubans is an example of cultural integrity. Mario insisted on the name for the orchestra. I'm black, which means my roots are in Africa. Why should I be ashamed of that? Mario used to tell club owners, "You don't like the name? We don't play here." The band Afro-Cubans, even after being targets of racism and injustice, never gave up on their name and became the first band of color to perform in a downtown New York venue. Young member of Machito and his Afro-Cubans named Tito Puente was one of the big band's drummers for a short period of time. But within this time, Tito got to learn new ways to fuse Afro-Cuban and Caribbean sounds like mambo and son. Tito reached popularity during the 1950s. He helped bring the Latin jazz to mainstream audiences and influenced many new musicians. His most well-known album is Dance Mania, released in 1958. Tito played all kinds of styles of music, from rumba during the 60s and Latin rock and disco during the 70s, but he always returned to his Latin jazz beginnings. Tito was known as El Rey de los Timbales, since he was one of the most influential Americans for Latin music in the 20th century. During his music career, Puente slowly built a puente in between Latin and American styles. Without Tito's musical fusion, artists as diverse as Carlos Santana, Celia Cruz, Domingo Quinones, Mark Anthony, and even Ricky Martin might very well have found themselves in a world much less receptive to and knowledgeable about Latin music. Latin jazz was not the only art form or influence that made Latin American culture what it is today, but it was a step that opened multiple doors and ideas to the community. The melodies and Afro-Cuban rhythms from Latin jazz were a base for the creation of salsa, the worldwide known term for Cuban and Puerto Rican popular dance music. Salsa became popular in the late 1960s with a record label called Fania Records, who were responsible for such popular artists as Hector Lavoe, Celia Cruz, and Willie Colon. Fania Records brought Latin American music to another level of popularity, what we could call mainstream Latin culture. Latinos of all backgrounds came together to listen to this music. Today, Latin Americans have a wide selection of Latin American music to choose from and identify with. But without artists such as Tito Puente, Machito, Mario Bauza, and Chano Pozo, this might not have been possible.